Hello and welcome to the Metamorphics podcast. Today I'm joined by Saj Razvi, the founder and director of education at PSI. He's a former clinical researcher in the MAPS Phase 2 trial of MDMA-assisted psychotherapy. He's also faculty at Synthesis and taught PTSD studies at the University of Denver and a PhD course at the University of Copenhagen. He's one of the primary developers of the Psychedelic Somatic Interactional Psychotherapy modality, which is the next generation primary consciousness-oriented psychotherapy. Really, the focus of PSIP is to maximize the relational and autonomic healing capacity of psychedelic medicine to treat complex childhood developmental trauma. This episode for me was so meaningful, so saturated with aliveness, with compassion and care for the human spirit, and sensitivity to the ways in which that spirit is crushed. And so it makes for a very dynamic, very real, very kind of raw conversation around trauma, around human nature, what it is, how it's distorted, how it is crushed, and how it can be, in a way, uncrushed. What does that even look like? What does trauma treatment look like? And we get into the weeds of that question throughout the entire conversation. We pretty much are talking from those weeds, and I had so much fun doing it. And I hope it's fun for you to listen to that. I hope you can kind of get a sense for what those weeds feel like, so to speak, from the inside. Enjoy. I just kind of want to start out with welcoming you, Saj, and happy to have you here.
Hi, Anders. Thank you for having me.
Yeah. So I was thinking we'd start out with just talking a little bit about PSIP. So psychedelic, somatic, interactional psychotherapy.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah.
Could you tell me a little bit about the history of its development? Well, how did it start? What were maybe the basic seeds, and then how did it grow to where it is today?
Yeah. Well, let me just first say that it is a synthetic model, meaning that there's elements that we really are borrowing from other traditions that we're grateful for. And then there's elements to it that are new and very specific to the psychedelic state of consciousness. In fact, I would say, everything that we're doing in the model is specific to the psychedelic state of consciousness. It is a fully built out comprehensive psychotherapy model that's designed to pair well and operate inside of the psychedelic state of consciousness. But in terms of the history of it, again, it's synthetic. It's coming from a number of different places: somatic psychology, psychodynamic, psychoanalytic psychology, memory systems literature. There's a number of pieces that really go into making it up. There was a version of this model that we taught, mostly specifically just located in Colorado, throughout the 2000s, and most like I think distinctly around 2008 is when we were running most of our trainings there. And then in 2014, I got involved with MAPS as an investigator with their phase 2 trial of MDMA-assisted psychotherapy for treatment-resistant PTSD. And I had not had much experience, really almost no experience with psychedelics prior to that, but I was focused on trauma. And so that's how I got involved with the trial. And what I saw was a game changer. What we can do in the world of psychedelic therapy compared to what I think we can accomplish in traditional therapy, even really good somatic or experiential therapies, is it's a world of difference. I think what we can accomplish, and so the MAPS trial that I was involved in went from 2014 to 2016, and during and after it, I thought, like, wow, this is fantastic. I see people making progress and accomplishing things that we would rarely see in the world of ordinary consciousness therapies. And and I thought to myself, well, this is great, but we're going to have to wait until what, 2021, and now potentially further, before something like MDMA comes about. So at that time, I was really conceptualizing this as a unique property of MDMA, what we were seeing here, and thought, okay, great. And then, Colorado being a cannabis-friendly state, one of the first cannabis-friendly states, we, myself and sort of a group of people that were doing this work, we just went along with our private practices, and we would have our clients tell us that they would take, they do their processing session, and then they would go home and maybe take a little bit of cannabis to help them sleep or recreationally. And they kept reporting that their body would move into the same processing mode that they were in when they were in therapy. And
Mm.
we found this very hard to believe. It just didn't seem like, cannabis, everybody knows it. Everybody, tried it in high school, or, it's a recreational drug. It's a multi-billion-dollar industry. And so there's no way that it will have the effect that these people are saying that it's having. Otherwise, people would not use it recreationally. And so ultimately, we invited them to, bring their cannabis into their therapy session with them. And sure enough, we watched it over and over again, and it had this remarkable property of, you know, changing what it does based on context. It moves from being, again, kind of a, more of a dissociative recreational experience to one of the most deeply excavating medicines that I've ever seen, particularly when it
Mm.
comes to working with something like dissociation. So this just continued to surprise us, and then we realized, like, okay, we do need to get more experience with this. So we developed a clinical arm of that at the time, where we just watched it over and over again, and of course then we started incorporating ketamine. And then, kind of and during this entire time, the training that I'd mentioned earlier, we had put on pause, simply because my thinking was that we cannot legitimately train people to work with trauma if we're
Mm-hmm.
not addressing psychedelics. And so after all of this, and after the data we were collecting on the ground from, what we saw with the anecdotal data of what we saw with cannabis and ketamine, then we sort of relaunched the training, being completely revamped to really incorporate and focus on those medicines. Now, I say completely revamped, but the truth is that, when you're working with body states, when you're working with sort of the memory systems that we're working with when engaging with past trauma, people enter into non-ordinary states of consciousness all the time, right? So there's lots of different pathways that people have into non-ordinary states. You can do medicine work with it. You can do, psychedelics. You can do chanting. You can do fasting. You could do dancing. You can, all sorts of pathways exist. Breath work will take people into non-ordinary states of consciousness. So that is kind of the, uh, you know, we went out there and looked at the different research that's, kind of gives an explanation of what's going on when people enter into non-ordinary states. And I think uh, for that piece, the sort of the best, most coherent theory that we found is the Robin Carhart Harris's entropic brain model. And that, to me, is such a useful sort of understanding of what's happening in the brain, what's happening with psychedelics. And so
Mm.
all of this comes together to what we have today, which is to say a psychotherapy model and a training program that's really designed for above ground use. Our focus is not so much on the medicine in this work. The medicine is important because it takes us to, psychedelic states of consciousness, or primary consciousness, as Carhart Harris would say. But the real, the why we can do this with something that's so common and ordinary as cannabis, and the responses that we have from that are really about the container. They're about the relationship. They're about the pathway that the psychedelic takes through a person, which is not a cognitive pathway. I think most
Mm.
people in the West exist as mind, and certainly if you've been
Mm-hmm.
doing talk therapy for 15 years, you're going to be set to process through your mind, through cognition and insight and meaning making, sort of all these functions of the human mind. And the proposal, I think what's coming out of the research that we're seeing with Carhart Harris is psychedelics are much more geared towards an embodied consciousness, a much more archaic,
Mm.
animalistic, direct experience, concrete form of being in the world. And so all the interventions in PSIP are designed to take people to their autonomic nervous system process, to their embodied experience of being here, and that ends up being the pathway that the medicine takes. And I think it greatly amplifies what something like cannabis can do. I'll just briefly say that. I know you asked one question. I'm just launching into all of this.
Mm.
I'll just briefly say that we have students that they've been professional therapists for 20, 25 years. They've done big medicine work. They've gone to Peru. They've had 4 nights of ayahuasca. And it's a very different container. It's a transpersonal container. It's a spiritual container. And what we're doing is not that. This is a very personal, and I would say pre-personal container, meaning focusing a lot on our biology and focusing on your experience even prior to your identity,
Mm.
and we have there's a phrase that often comes up in our trainings that people will take 2 puffs of cannabis and they'll have these really powerful experiences. They're not nuanced, they're not mild, they don't take place in the brain, they take place, they take over, right? So let me pause there. Since
Yeah, well,
yeah.
I mean, there's so much that I could pull on there that would be so rich. And, specifically what's calling out to me is this transpersonal element to medicine work, and how that's actually different. And kind of like what you said there, which is, this is more pre-personal. It's not quite transpersonal. The focus isn't really going to images or even the higher order meaning of what is happening, but more so going to the sensate experience in the body, the kind of visceralness, the in the moment body, and whenever mind comes up. And this might be a time to introduce like selective inhibition, um, and whenever the mind comes up is actually generally not to go there, but to go right into the back into the body, back into the moment to moment bodily experience. And something I would hope, I kind of want to talk about it, maybe we end up talking about it right now, but is um, I am someone who has experienced this firsthand, this specific modality, and I know in my own experience, very transpersonal like experiences would come up, um, that would maybe come up on like similar to maybe even like psilocybin. And there is a certain way in which I would relate to that outside of PSI, outside of the modality, where I'd maybe go into the images, I'd go into the form and maybe get a little caught up there, and actually the facilitator bringing me back to my body and something shifting a lot in a much deeper way than I had anticipated. It's kind of like, whoa, that's there. It's like that whole like it's that whole wellspring of sensation and contraction, and movement that I have no control over is just right there. Mm.
Yeah. Yeah, and so maybe you're pointing to sort of the direction that psychedelics tend to go in mostly in the field today in terms of transpersonal for benefit versus where we're going in the PSIP model, which is, again, body, embodiment, personal, your life, your humanness, your human realm experience is where we're focusing. The basic idea that for us is that, that we're using psychedelics as an adjunct to psychotherapy, as an adjunct, as part of a trauma treatment modality. And what we know is that, the vast amount of what causes people to be in psychotherapy, what causes symptoms, is relational trauma, is the things that have happened to people in their childhood when, we're in the particularly developmentally sensitive window. If you're having trauma at that point, it's profound, right? It's very different than if you have trauma when you're a 20-year-old. Your personality is formed already. You're not going through as nearly as sensitive developmental periods. And so because of that, we are directing the psychedelic session away from transpersonal processes into personal and prepersonal processes. So, which is to say, for example, I think imagery, visions can be a very much a powerful, useful, interesting part of transpersonal experience. A lot of insight, a lot of shifting of, your relationship to the world. That is a beautiful container, and that is beautiful work. There's nothing to take away from that. It is different than taking psychedelics into the realm of trauma and mental health, though. And so, for example, one of the things that we will do is very much direct people away from vision and the imagination capacity that people have. And one of the reasons for that is that oftentimes it can be a defense mechanism for people to sort of enter that realm. And it can be beautiful, it can be fascinating, but it's unending. It can be endless, and so what we're directing people to is their autonomic reality. What is it like to be them? What is their felt sense in this moment? And what you'll find there is, that reliably takes people to their trauma, that will reliably take people to the compromise that lives in their nervous system. And I think the reason why that is because our systems are really focused on resolving this compromise. Our biology does not want to exist in a state of, compromise from trauma, like dissociative compromise or states of activation that we're sort of constantly managing about ourselves. And when we finally end the management, when we finally inhibit the management, which you were alluding to in terms of our primary intervention in the model, is something called selective inhibition, which is essentially just the opposite of mostly what happens. And so maybe actually before we go into there, maybe I'll pause here because I think we just talked a bit about what's going on, the direction of the model going personal and prepersonal versus transpersonal, and the different pathways we might use for that. So I don't know if we want to jump off of that and we can pause on the selective inhibition piece for now.
Yeah. A lot was coming up for me as you were talking about this is slightly a deviation, but the imagination channels, and how often that is used as a defense. And I have been continuously and repetitively surprised by the levels of defense that's even in my own imagination.
Yeah.
And how subtle it is. I'll be in the middle of what I would describe as, I'm essentially watching my body move and process in this relational container, almost like a movie unfolding. And then out of nowhere, I'm now in the future, somewhere else. And it's usually some kind of imaginative scenario or theme that's trying to resolve everything, or make things better, or it's feel things are bad. It's like, oh, it's going to be bad, and then just how quickly that all falls away like a house of cards when I just come right back to my body
Mhm.
in this relational dynamic. Because I think the relational dynamic too might be, at least in my own experience, what is so necessary, at least for getting me to stay present with the body.
Yeah.
It's like once I bring awareness to the therapist or the facilitator, something opens up that before it was not I wasn't even aware of.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. The relationship is what keeps the process in the human realm, right? Yeah, because I mean, you're having relationship when you're having a relationship with the existential, with the divine, right there. That is still relationship, but that's again a transpersonal relationship. Versus
Hmm.
if you're like tracking, if you're aware of your therapist, if you're aware of the projections that you're having onto this person, which typically will be familial projections, right? You're the good and the bad, the idealized parent and the actual parent that you got. All of these things will be playing out once you're aware that there's a human being in the room with you. um, and they don't play out when you're just kind of in your eye shades and headphones. You're in your own imaginal realm with it. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, and I don't want to be on this for too long, but there is something too about when that relational piece is there and alive, and you are in the body as fully as possible. There is something that feels like it's actually moving, like some kind of really deep structure
Yeah.
that's been frozen is actually moving. Whereas in the imagination, um, things don't, that structure doesn't move. It doesn't tend to move the way
Yeah.
that it does when you're really in it,
Yeah.
connected.
I love your description of this, Anders, because it's a very kind of nuanced thing, but it's incredibly powerful. When you are embodied, you're feeling the stuckness of your history. You're feeling the stuckness of your psyche, and that can manifest as literal stuckness, or feel like heaviness or collapse, or people can feel like a statue frozen inside of
Hmm.
themselves. But it's there's a, a sensate, visceral quality to these psychological phenomenon that we can be in contact with, and that's exactly what begins to shift in the model. Which you're right,
Hmm.
that what we're referring to there, that edifice, that that physicality, it does not shift with imagination. Yeah.
Mm-mm. Yeah, and it's funny too because you'll see, at least in my own experience and also my experience working with people, not with medicine, but just in psychotherapy, is when they do go to the body and they do go to this present moment visceral physicality of their experience, there's usually kind of like a, oh no, I don't want to do that, like not that. It's like that was the, no, that's the last thing I want to go to.
Yeah.
But there's a sort of sense of when that does happen, it something's moving, and
Hmm.
it's good. It's like a good sort of, oh, this is where I need to be, but
Hmm.
I don't like it.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, we
It's
call
like
it the
it's,
nightmare.
yeah.
Go ahead. I'm sorry.
Well, it's like it's worse than, in the moment it's more not worse, it's more intense than what was happening in the imagination
Yeah.
or in the mind, but in a way something's moving. It's like you're in a catalyzing container for change to happen.
Yeah. I think so first, I think it's worth mentioning here that, the shifts that take place in the PSIP model are all bottom up shifts. They're all sort of cellular, they're biological, they're psychobiological, I should say. They're sensate, right? Um, it's very visceral, the movement that takes place. And I think when that kind of movement happens, oftentimes people don't have new insights, new awareness, new connecting the dots, or anything like that. The shifts that will happen is, that how you're the shifts that happen are very difficult to give language to. I think. There's shifts that happen in your beingness in the world, like walking
Mm.
down the street and feeling the world around you, feeling relationship, feeling, just sort of when dissociation clears, for example, it's very difficult to give language to what that's like. But all of a sudden, you are so much more in the world. I would say that's the
Mm.
level of shift that's happening. And,
Mm.
options become available to people that they didn't notice before, options for, you know, being curious about something that they couldn't be curious about before because the reactivity would take them over, things like that. Yeah.
Yeah, I really like what you're saying about the being curious, and it's not even, and I think where it comes with the verbal piece of trying to articulate what is changing, um, is because they're very much invisible walls that are then going away in a way, like new aspects of thought open up, new directions of where you can bring your attention to your own experience open up, because now it's not dysregulating to
Mhm.
be aware of my hips or something like that, or
Yeah.
my chest. It's just there available to me to be aware of and feel. And I think what would be interesting to shift a little bit, and I'm just curious about how you view trauma.
Mm.
And I know it's such a big
Mhm.
topic, and um, in a way it's complicated, but
Mhm.
I'm wondering if you could reflect on what is trauma.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's overwhelm, right? It's something, it's real or perceived threat that an organism goes through and has, what I would call predictable responses to. And you know those response the way we conceive of trauma is that it's a relationship between one's biology and the environment, the threat environment that we're facing, and the capacities that we have in that environment. And by capacities, I don't just mean sort of your personal capacities of defense, but also relational capacities. Like, so for example, human beings, you know when we're little, like all of our
Hmm.
defensive capacity comes from relationship. That, when you're a kid and you're scared and something big is happening, you're going to go to mom, right? You're going to go to dad. You're going to go to, so, trusted people in your family. So we, as social animals, our primary defense to scary, threatening things that happen to us is relationship. That's not
Mm.
necessarily true for other animals, right? So most other animals born into the world have their own defensive capacities. A horse born into the world will be up and running, within a few hours,
Hmm.
versus an infant really takes what, like, I don't know, like 18 years of, support and protection and guidance. And so, I mean, so we're unique in
Mm.
this way. And so this is all to say that, again, going back to how I conceive of trauma, it is a relationship between an organism, the threat environment they're in, and the solution or the resources they have to deal with the threat. The more solutions an organism has, the less traumatized that organism will become. Because
Hmm.
simply because it's inact. So let me make this concrete. Like, let's say, you know, there's a scary situation and that's faced by a 5-year-old versus a Marine, right? And so
Hmm.
the
Hmm.
Marine, being an adult and being a very capable person, has so much more capacities that, they might not even notice that this thing is this event is a
Hmm.
stressful speed bump in the road, versus a 5-year-old might just be completely overwhelmed by this thing, right? So that's what I'm talking about, the relationship there. Now, that I will also say that, trauma affects all of us. I mean, certainly it affects our thought patterns, our belief systems, and things like that. But I think that's just you know, the 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 surface of it. Like, I mean, I think really what we're looking at here is much more profound changes in the brain, much more profound changes in nervous system, much more profound changes in how we sort of conceive of self and world at a very core object relations level.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. And I think that's kind of getting I wanted to also talk about dissociation, but
Mhm,
something that's really interesting that you're saying now is something I've noticed in this work is my understanding of personality has been shifting
mhm,
um, quite a bit of what personality is, of how our sense of self is structured somatically, and in a way, when doing this work, when it's going well, in my experience, my sense of who I am is so radically shaken. Not necessarily in a bad way, but like actually usually quite, in a way that feels more in line with um, so what is true and what is like really connected to a sort of ground of like fundamental relationship.
mhm.
Um, but something that it's kind of brought to my attention is usually the person I think I am as I'm going about my day is different than the person that I am after like a session, for example.
Yeah.
Something has been shifted. And it makes me think about like, well, what is personality? Because it's kind of viewed as this really stable entity in modern medicine and psychoanalysis and psychotherapy and psychology that isn't really going to shift much. But I see in these sessions it shifting radically, which makes me think like, what even is personality? I'm wondering if you have thoughts on that or reflections on that. Maybe not, but
No, I think this is an awesome topic. I mean, it's kind of inside baseball for psychology nerds, but but um, yeah, because I mean, I think this gets at again, like, so let me just briefly. I think a good way of sort of opening the door to this question is talking about how Robin Carhart Harris conceives of what's happening in human cognition in that entropic brain model that I mentioned earlier. So very briefly, you know, and if people don't know, Carhart Harris is a neuroscientist. He is at Imperial College in London, and he's famous. He has an incredible amount of publications, and he's famous for putting people in scanners as they're undergoing psychedelic experiences to look at what the biological shifts are that are taking place at the level of our brains. And so, what he's coming to is the sense that human beings really are capable of two very distinct forms of cognition. One he refers to as secondary consciousness, which is it's a Freudian term originally, right? Like primary process and secondary process. So what Carhart Harris means by that is essentially sort of a form of cognition that we are operating in right now. Right? It's your adult, ordinary, waking mind. It's capable of, complex metacognitive thought. It's we do meaning making here. We do goal orientation here. It's verbal. It's abstract. It's conceives of time, right? And it's like, so I imagine it like if you're imagining playing a game of chess, and you're looking from above and you're seeing the chessboard and you're seeing the strategy and the moves, and you're dreaming into what your opponent is going to do. That is all the beauty of
mm,
secondary consciousness, right? And in fact, we are mostly steeped in it. Everything in modern civilization is a function of secondary consciousness. And ultimately, it's a fantastic survival mechanism, because what it's designed to do is filter out the noise of experience and just allow in a clear signal by which we can ultimately like predict what's going to be happening in our environment, and ultimately manipulate our environment. So all of modern civilization is on top of this human function
mm,
of secondary consciousness, right? Everything you're in touching right now, the technology that we're working with right now, is a result of secondary consciousness, right? We're manipulating our environment to do things that we want, for good or ill, right? We can do that. So, but primary consciousness is what we're referring to. We've been talking about this entire time in terms of where people go under the effect of psychedelics. It's much more fluid. It's much more chaotic. It's much more. Think about having a dream. right? Your
Mm.
dream is primary consciousness, and there's no reality to it. There's no stable ground to it. There's no, like when you think about the psychotherapy intervention of reality testing, for example, right?
Hmm.
There's no you can reality test in this world in secondary consciousness, but there's no reality testing in a dream state because there is no stable reality there. And the
Hmm.
whole reason why I bring that up is to sort of go into the question that you brought up in terms of the stability of personality, Anders, which is to say that um, that secondary consciousness leads to a stable sense of world, a stable cognition of the world, and a stable sense of self in the world. Uh, and in fact, we know from research that people that have an overly expressed secondary consciousness, there's a strong correlation with a depressive personality. And that
Mm.
makes sense, right? It's almost like saying, like, if you have no beginner's mind in the world, if you have a
Yeah.
sense that, like, you're so stable that you know of everything, there's nothing new under the sun, it's like there's no room
Yeah.
for novel
Mm.
experiences to come into your world, right?
Mm.
So I think that stability of personality, and why psychology is traditionally thought that personality is unchanging, is because we're looking at beings that pretty much exist in secondary consciousness. If you look at primary consciousness, and why I think it's so useful in therapy, is because there is nothing stable there. You are not a stable self there. There's a fluidity to your experience. There's, for example, if people feel depression in secondary consciousness, when you make contact with that experience of depression in primary consciousness, it moves, right? Nothing is stable in primary consciousness, which is, I think, kind of a beautiful thing, right? Like, yeah, you can't build, an entire, like, world on top of it the way that humans have built a world on top of secondary consciousness. But there's such a moment to moment, present moment contact with the world and
Yes.
relationship that is ever changing, fluid, and I would say alive.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, that is so interesting. It's it's something that comes up in my own sessions and also sessions that I do as a therapist with clients. Is my sense is it's like we could do the sort of chess game, speak like talking back and forth and secondary consciousness, and we might be working for 10 years to see a small shift in your sense of self, understanding and insight, you know, or we could see what's happening right now, uh, in this moment to moment changing reality that's just occurring between us right now,
Yeah.
and and that movement is actually quite terrifying, um,
Yeah.
because and I think it's going into what you were saying. It's like because in the secondary consciousness, it seems that our survival is dependent on us knowing and being able to figure out what to do, um, and to be able to strategize and have a plan and sort of have control here. And then
Yeah.
there's that movement down into primary, which maybe threatens that to a degree. Um, and psychedelics seem to be a facilitator of getting us there,
Primary.
but
Yeah.
maybe not necessary entirely for us to move to that level. I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think we don't want to throw away any of the human experience, which is to say that, like, great, let's have secondary, let's use it for what it's good for, which I think personally, I think it's a fantastic tool. Like, whatever we're up to in life, secondary will amplify and support us getting there,
Mm.
right? But that's all it is. It's a tool. It's not where I think fundamentally human beings can or should be living from. You know, I
Mm.
think there's a whole nother, like, level of humanness and empathy and morality and worthiness that come from this contact with our nature in primary consciousness. And
Mm.
which is really kind of a fascinating topic as well, in terms of, um, like, secondary is very concerned with identity and things like and personality, when in fact when you go to primary consciousness, what are you holding on to? There's not, what kind of identity are you so wedded to that you're going to, we're much less locked into sort of the cages that come with identity when you're working, at this pre-personal level.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, go for it.
Yeah. Well, there's this sensation I get when I do sessions of it's almost like I'm taking off like an old pair of boots or something. And that process can be quite unnerving. And it's kind of like, oh, but that's like this is who I thought I was, and then it kind of goes away, and it's just like this is aliveness. It's like it almost becomes irrelevant. Like
Mhm.
whoever I took myself to be is so irrelevant to what matters most
Yeah,
in my life. What is like most dear to me above everything else. It just kind of slips, it just falls away. Just
yeah, I love
and
it.
and in that, and this is where I kind of have a hard time sometimes talking about because it feels like it's making a big claim, but it does feel connected to our nature, and it does feel connected to the heart of where morality lives and where goodness lives and where the ability um to be with what is most true and most matters in our in life, in our experience. That's the sensation I have. Um, yeah,
Yeah,
it is a big claim, but that's just that's the sensation that's the experience I have every time I kind of tap into that and come and exist from that place.
yeah, yeah. And the interesting thing is that it's still not transpersonal. I guess it is transpersonal in some ways, but you're going deeper into yourself to find the transpersonal. So it's a version of the transpersonal that doesn't negate your humanness, that doesn't sort of take away the things that have happened to you. So those are still relevant. And in fact, it's very interested in the things that have happened to you. And because those are the stuck points, right? But
Uh-huh.
yeah, so yeah, it's not going into the cosmos for the transpersonal. It's
No,
digging into
yeah.
the earth, digging into sort of self to find the transpersonal living like right in the middle of your chest, right? And so yeah, yeah.
And that's why I really was so moved by this model. And it's not necessarily a model, it's just the experience and the relational container that allows for it to unfold so safely. um, is that yeah, it is transpersonal in like a literal sense because it's it's kind of beyond just your everyday sense of who you are,
Mhm.
but it's almost more you. It's like it's going into more of your particulars. um yeah, rather than, you know, it's like maybe in a sense if it's meeting God, it's just meeting the God that's already here in you and between you, and not necessarily going out into the cosmos, out of your human life. It's more into it, more
That's
into
it.
your life.
Yeah, it's the way I experience it, and I think a lot of people would describe it this way, is that it's like a signal that's not you, but that's completely guiding your personal psychological process, right? It's completely
Hmm.
guiding, um, it's completely working with the things that have crushed you in your life. So yeah, it's not transcending your life, it's taking something that's much deeper and bigger and having that enter into your personal process. You're dancing with this, and it is you at the same time.
Uh-huh.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
it's awesome. Anders, if we touched on something that really it strikes a chord with me, and feel free to edit this out if you feel like but it's a morality piece that lives in primary consciousness. So I remember, this was maybe, I don't know, a month ago or something like that, and I was watching a news show, and on it, Joe Biden was eating an ice cream cone and talking about genocide, talking about what I think most of the world at this point sees as a
Hmm.
very purposeful genocide of an entire people.
Mm-hmm.
And if not that, then if you don't want to use that word, then call it mass murder of a whatever
Sure.
words that
Yeah.
you want to
Yeah.
call it, right?
Right.
That like a purposeful starvation and killing of children and
Yeah.
civilians.
Yeah.
And so it struck me at that moment. I was thinking, wait a minute, Joe Biden is a lifelong Catholic, right? And
Mm-hmm.
how is he so comfortable with this? How is he so comfortable? He's eating an ice cream cone, experiencing pleasure while talking about genocide. And so it
Mm-hmm.
struck me that there's something bizarre going on here, which to me, when I see this, it's like, oh, his, I don't know the man personally, obviously,
Mm-hmm.
but that kind of morality is a secondary consciousness morality. It's coming
Yes.
from
Yes.
ideas of right and wrong and things like that that are secondary consciousness in nature. It's not coming from primary consciousness, which would just be horrified at this.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Wow.
You know?
Yeah. That's so cutting and true. And there's, and seeing the ways in which so much of, yeah, the tool and the skill of secondary consciousness, which allows for, I mean, us to even be having this conversation, is also so unable to feel the depth of what is happening,
Yeah,
and could and can eat an ice cream cone and talk about genocide without being impacted by it. And yeah, able to, we use the word genocide, and what does that even point to?
right.
And again, right now, I'm only half connected to what it means.
Yeah,
Yeah, and I agree. I think the closer you come into that more prime, like the more your home is in primary consciousness, and and is sensitive to that signal, so to speak, it's, yeah, it doesn't seem to be possible to not be impacted then by
yeah,
what is right. And like in a way that it's not like, it's not coming from like strategy, like, oh, what seems like it should be more morally correct. It's just it's an impact.
yeah. That's it. That's it, right? And I think the Buddhists might refer to that as, right action. Like it's just right in this moment. You just know what's right in this moment. That, starving children and women and, civilian
Oh,
population is just not right.
yeah.
No matter what kind of mental constructs people have that kind of pervert and contort and whatever maze that your secondary consciousness has to establish to make this okay, primary would never do that. Right. So my hope, my wish for this, and what the vision that I want to see in the world, and why I love this work and I do this work and I'll be doing it for the rest of my life, is I would love for people, again, to use secondary consciousness as a tool to do really wonderful things in the world. But what is directing that tool is their morality, is the person, it's the
Mm.
sensitivity to life that can come from primary consciousness, right? So it's, yeah, have religious traditions that are based in a direct experience of the awe of being here, and not
Hmm.
not ideas of morality, but direct experience of what is moral in the world.
Yeah, I love what you're saying. I love what you're saying, and it's been my experience too. It's, and especially in seeing in certain, uh in people who are reciting certain religious texts, that what it's referring to is the sort of goodness and right view and right morality. Um, but then the way that they conceive of it, and then continue to act out what they're doing,
Yeah,
seems to not be getting the message of it. I'm following the rules, but I'm not actually hearing the message behind the rules.
yeah, yeah. Which
Hmm.
is, I mean, the inherent limitation of secondary consciousness, right? It's not, like, there can be a lot of defenses in it from our humanness, and there's a lot of defenses in it from recognizing the humanness of other, and also the defenses of recognizing our own frailty and where we've come from in the world. So
Mm.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think of in my own experience doing this is the ways in which the ways that I've been acting in the world, in a certain habits or traits that I've just taken on melt away when I come into contact with what feels like my nature.
Yeah.
And it's not a shame-based thing. It's not like, oh, I shouldn't be that way. It's like I'm not that. It's like
Yes. Yeah.
there's no like I feel no remorse, or I not remorse. I don't feel any like what's the word? I don't miss it. I
Hmm.
I don't miss that old way of being because that was never me to
Hmm.
begin with. And now that I'm like connected to myself here, I wouldn't even think to care about, like I wouldn't even think to even think or about that or move in that direction. It's almost like I wouldn't be allowed to because it's just not me.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I love that. I love that because what you're describing is there's no shoulds in this world of primary consciousness. There's no discipline. There's no top down, like, okay, I'm gonna like be a
Yeah.
better person or something like that. You know, like your dog never tries to. Well, dog isn't a good idea because but like,
Yeah.
animals don't ever try to be a better animal. They just are what they are, right? And I would propose to you that there is a fundamental goodness of that. You know, when we say somebody's like behaving like an animal as if that's a bad thing,
Uh-huh.
it's like,
Right.
oh,
Yeah.
we
Yeah.
should strive to behave like an animal because they're such like they're in touch with something that's so good
Mm.
about the world, you know.
Mm.
Yeah, so yeah, I loved how you put it, that like you're not fighting things there, you just are what you are. And going back to something that you touched on earlier, this movement, if you've lived an entire life in secondary consciousness identity, this movement to primary might be scary and it will be destabilizing. It should be destabilizing. You've built an edifice on top of
Yes.
that might not be you at all, like.
Right.
So I,
Right.
I I remember I can't remember what teacher I heard this from, but they described, maybe it was Ram Dass, but they described like dying as like taking off an old shoe that was too tight, you know.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
And so
Exactly.
and I was struck when you use that same imagery to describe what primary consciousness is. It's absolutely like that. So yeah, it's destabilizing, but I would ask, who is it destabilizing for? It's is it
Mm-hmm.
destabilizing for your primary consciousness? Absolutely not. Like your primary consciousness swims in that fluidity. It's destabilizing for your secondary consciousness that thinks you're a stable noun. So
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah.
It's moving from noun to verb,
Hmm.
and just
Hmm.
seeing the extent to which your experience has been nounified, so to speak. Um, which it can be quite great.
Yeah.
Um, the way you said the edifice is kind of built on top of this, and yeah, there's elements of that edifice that aren't for many people, and this has been true in my own experience, but aren't an accurate representation of who I am
Yeah.
at all, and how trapping that can feel, and how wrong that can just feel in the whole system, almost like an allergic reaction or something.
Mm-hmm.
But it makes me kind of want to circle back to personality change, like personality disorders, because when I think of personality disorders, and they're not all the same, but um, I do think of this. I think of the way in which almost everybody I've worked with who has a personality disorder has that sort of feeling of phoniness or feeling of this isn't me.
Hmm.
I'm going to be found out or exposed. And that's what that makes me think of this in some way. And I don't really have anywhere I'm going with that exactly, but it makes me think of if the container was built in such a way that that could be held, that fear, that overwhelming fear of, the worst thing happening, you're being found out now, and you're still here, and I'm here with you right now, and
Yeah.
we can follow this all the way down to where it needs to be, which you've never had that experience before of being in a relationship all the way down here.
Mhm.
Yeah, that's what I think of.
I mean, you're applying it to the scenario of that experience in personality disorder of feeling discrepancy between sort of the constructed self, the secondary consciousness self, and they know that there's something else going on, right? So I think that's I've not worked enough in this model with that population to tell you what that I think what that would be like. But speaking more generally of, the a big component of the PSIP model is to say, yeah, wherever this takes you into the worst part of your nightmare, whatever that may be for you, let's have relationship there. Let's see what happens to your system when we put such an incredibly um, something that's so necessary for humans to feel safe in the world. Let's add that to this place that never had it. Yeah.
Mm.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's making, like, I want to ask this question. It's kind of a could be a complicated question, but is there a point in this work where you are done, or
Mm.
is it a sort of, like, is there a sort of work? Okay, I have worked through trauma in some way, and I've and there's this decisive moment where I'm done,
Mhm.
and I don't necessarily need to do this work consistently again. Or is it a long-term kind of, like, you'll be doing this,
Yeah.
maybe like kind of touch-ups, so to speak.
Mhm.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, again, I think we have to look at the motivations for why people would do this work. If you're coming in because you're having symptoms, if you're having, anxiety, depression, panic attacks, inability to have relationships, those types of things, then I think there is a time frame for that. And by the way, and I don't think that means 100% resolution of all of somebody's trauma. I think what we tend to see is when somebody goes in with the medicine and this nervous system pathway that we, through the model, develop further into their system, the the process goes pretty much to the core of what's going on with them, um, and so in other words, I think when people choose to stop doing this work is when, not when they have 100% resolution of all the trauma in their life, but when they have enough resolution where they're not suffering anymore and life
Mm.
feels good. They can have relationships, they can live life and things feel good. So there's, I think, sort of a good enough model for most people, because
Mm-hmm.
simply because I think it's suffering and that drives people to to do this work.
Yeah.
But now, having said that, for me personally, I mean, from everything we're describing of this, like,
Mhm.
I feel like, for myself, that I'm not determined by the traumas that have happened to me anymore, although they were really, really profound and early and like formative of my psyche. um I feel that I do this work because it's a continuing way of maintaining, like, taking a deep dive relationship with that signal that we're talking about. And you know, I want that in my life in a way that, what I would say is, for me, an endpoint of what this looks like is, like, I want a permeable relationship between my
Mm.
secondary conscious self and my primary consciousness, so that,
Mm.
there's a fluid back and forth movement between these two realms of my being. And which case it seems like ideal, right? Like, in other words, I've got the foundation, I've got the ground, I've got stability, I've got sort of this sense of, support and goodness of the world that I can drink in. And from there, then I can go off and do things. I can create things. I can use my secondary consciousness, to have this training organization that is dedicated to furthering the cause of primary consciousness in the world. So in other words, I think the more supported we are in the world by spirit, by this primary
Yeah.
consciousness signal,
Yeah.
the more we can actually accomplish good in the world.
Yeah, this is moving. I was moved just listening to you talk there. And there's something kind of funny about the word that came to my mind was spirit. Exactly when you said spirit, I wanted, because what you were referring to, signal doesn't do it justice.
Mm,
It's like it almost feels like spirit is like it, like connecting body to spirit. It's like there's something about that that feels so
mhm,
resonant,
mhm.
in what you were saying. And yeah, and I guess that language won't always work for some people, but
Yeah,
I think the the poetic nature of spirit really, I think, reflects more so the actual direct experience of that signal.
yeah, yeah. Um, the lovely part is it doesn't care what you call it. It's gonna
Yeah.
it's gonna be there. It's gonna be doing its thing. It's like so clear in the world, folks. This is not a mild experience, as you can hear. I think we're like, we're connecting around this. It's not mild. It takes over, and for me, the more that it can take over and the less that I can orchestrate, I cannot orchestrate my own healing. I cannot. It's like when something is so big that your consciousness is inside of it, you cannot find the way out of that hole, right? But you're this much deeper connection that we're talking about, whether it's signal or spirit, is orchestrating things that are beyond your horizon, right? So beyond what you can
Mm,
see.
mm. So this feels like such a beautiful moment, and I have so many questions that
Uh-huh.
I was going to ask you, and they feel like they would just, it'd be like eating the ice cream right now. Joe Biden eating the ice cream. There's just something about it that just feels like it
Mhm.
doesn't connect to the depth of what we're talking about in this conversation. Um, but I will I will ask something that I notice in certain relational types of practices. You may not be familiar with them, but there's ones that I'm thinking of are circling, authentic relating, um, or even contact improv.
Mhm.
There's a way in which uh, you know within a relational container you start to play with more spontaneous, less conceptual mind ways of being that I think touch on that signal, that can open the relationship to that signal.
Mhm.
However, you can do these practices and then still have that core sort of, if you want to call it nightmare, or
Mhm.
that can still be present and not touched. And
Yeah.
and I see you nodding, so I think maybe it's making sense. But there's a way in which this process really gets to that.
Yeah.
Um, but then I think of what are auxiliary practices that could help people still keep in contact with it if they don't necessarily have um, someone to facilitate them through this deeper kind of uh, nightmarish
Mhm.
solution work.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think what you're pointing to in the question, Anders, is that there is a relationship between something like trauma and people's access to signal, right? And because you're right, we can have relationship that can sort of take us there as well, and I think the less trauma people have, the more available they already are to that signal. I'll put it this way: if somebody comes into me and they have, like a pretty stable childhood, they have secure attachment, they trusted their parents, they felt safe with their parents, and maybe they
Mm,
had trauma later on in life or something
mm,
like that, but we can work with that person, and then in their first session, even without medicine, this person, and I've done this, I have videos of what this looks like, where this person can make contact with that signal and it just takes over. They can go into
mm,
an autonomic wave of sort of processing, and
mm,
so, which is to say that, I mean, they're not defended against their own nature. right? And
Mm-hmm.
they're not having to work through really dense layers of trauma and dissociation to get there. And I think that's why this modality exists. It's because I think, you know, um, we our systems use dissociation as a defense against the trauma that's happened to us, so we can survive and be functional in the world. And the
Mm.
one of the horrors of trauma is that it really kind of separates us from that essence, that core signal where that is our birthright, I would say.
Yes.
So is this
Yes.
getting at what you're?
Yeah, it is, and um, well, and it is also bringing up for me. We've kind of touched on this, but it's coming at it from a slightly different angle of when coming into contact with our nature. Th there's a way in which this all of the ways we've contracted against it and defended against it, that's maybe more so what we're coming into contact with
Yeah.
more acutely,
Uh-huh.
rather than the goodness and the feeling of being connected. It's actually the horror, of the possibility of connection and what that could mean. Um, and I think of, especially doing this work, and what I have learned is when I'm able to let myself go to where what feels most true, I have a lot of ideas on what that's going to look like, which are usually terrifying. But then it kind of ends up me being like a little infant. Like I'm taking the shape of and feeling like I'm this tiny infant, or like this 4-year-old child. And once I'm there, there's something about it. It's like I'm in it. There's
Yeah.
something that's shifted. It
Yeah.
doesn't necessarily feel positive.
Mhm.
Um, it could still feel kind of nightmarish, but there's something about it that feels like, okay, this is where I need to be. Um,
Yeah.
and I think of what I think, I don't even know if there's any question in this at all, but when I see that, I gain this hard to describe understanding that that is what's under the surface with my parts of my everyday ego self. There's
Mhm.
like this infantile sort of defense or contraction
Yeah.
that has produced a certain edifice almost on the
Pro-
surface.
You mean produced an adult built on top of the rageful infant, right? Yeah,
Yeah.
no, I agree. And I think what you're pointing to here is some of the ways that this model works, which is regression, right? We will somatically, viscerally regress to periods of our lives when, these we got crushed. And that regression is really unique because I think we tend to think like, oh well, like in therapy it's like, yeah, I'm an adult thinking and imagining what it's like to be a child. And
Mm.
this regression feels so different than that. It's
Hmm.
so somatic, meaning that it feel I mean, it's a subjective experience, but I'll just speak to you from my subjective experience of it. But it doesn't feel like an adult dreaming into being a child. It feels like you are a child. You have regressed to that mind and you've regressed to that body.
Yes.
I can feel when my autonomic process is working and my arm is, or my hand is reaching out towards my practitioner that's working with me, that it feels like an infant arm that's doing that
Uh-huh.
movement, not an adult arm. And so I think that's when the work is at its best, when the regression is so thorough, we're in that place. And sometimes, we'll do defensive movements. There'll be traumatic waves that are moving through the infant body, uh, dissociation that's happening at the level of the infant mind. All of that can happen. But I find that once that has been cleared, those reactions have been cleared, then what opens up is the developmental processes that would have happened if not for the trauma, right? So the developmental processes that got stunted, like reaching out and touching the face of your therapist, but
Mm.
the infant is touching the face of her parent for the first time, and really like
Uh-huh.
internalizing that the other is truly there, for the first
Ah,
time.
yeah.
Things like
Wow.
that can tend to
Wow.
happen. You know?
I see that. And so I think this is getting to the answer of my original
Mhm.
question about maybe the more spontaneous, authentic relating practices that are almost informed by the signal in a way,
Mhm.
but this is this isn't just being informed by the signal. It's like living through it. There's a
Mhm.
way in which it's as if I'm a child right now, or it's as if I'm an infant. It's the difference being it's not an as if, it's a direct experience
Yeah.
of being that.
Yeah. Yeah. And you're doing relationship as that. Right.
Yes, which I think may be fundamental to this work.
It's very important to the work. I think like that. So our systems are intelligent, and so we're making an assessment of the container, we're making an assessment of our environment. And if that person isn't there, if mom or dad is not there, your system's not going to open the door to that regression.
Hmm.
And so I think this is where the PSIP therapist, the majority of the training for this is for you to be doing your own work, which is to say that, I mean, my experiences of having that regression, if my practitioner, if the person I was working with was not able to be fluid with that, able to be saying like, okay, I am so letting go of, the context, the secondary consciousness context of here I am in a therapy office and a therapeutic relationship with an adult, and I'm an adult, and I,
Uh-huh.
I need to let go of that and step into what's actually happening here, which is an infant is reaching for me, and I
Oh,
have to
yeah.
become
Yeah.
parent here, and just if this was my own child, how would I be with this my own child?
Mhm.
That is what is being called for in the moment.
Yeah. Yeah, and then I mean, that's almost the morality piece of it that it's just coming to me now yeah, you're not thinking, "Oh, this is like an infant reaching to me," as the therapist. And maybe there is that secondary, but there's a way in which you're actually embodied in the movement. Like
Mhm.
you're witnessing the signal, but you're also responding to it.
That's it. Yeah. So
Mhm.
the PSIP therapist again has a one foot in their secondary consciousness and one foot in their primary consciousness, right? So when their
Mm.
client is operating from primary and they're operating through the signal, the PSIP therapist is 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 again, they're having right action in that moment. They're saying like, I know how to dance with this, I know how to interact with this, because they're operating from primary as well.
Mm.
It's like kind of like maybe a little bit of what like tends to happen in ceremonial experiences when the shaman might take a ceremony, like a working dose of whatever medicine,
Uh-huh.
so they've got one foot in that world, one foot in ordinary reality. But in this case, the PSIP therapist has done their own work, so they have a very friendly relationship between the two, between secondary and primary, and they can sort of move back and forth depending on what's needed in the moment.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's so fun. That's so necessary.
Yeah.
I I think if you can't do ethical and I think ethically transformative work unless you have been there yourself.
Yeah.
Because yeah, you end up you do reinforce a sort of secondary consciousness, like whoa, we're two adults right now, and you're being kind of weird right now with
Can you imagine? Oh God, like
oh
I'm just trying to picture that in some of these moments of regression, how painful that would be if my therapist could not flow into the contact and into the world that my system was creating. Right? That's what I would consider re-traumatizing,
yes,
not
it's an
not
injustice.
not
Yeah,
going to not going to the wound, but the inability of your practitioner to go there with you. I would consider re-traumatizing.
I completely agree. Completely agree. Hmm. I had maybe one more. There was one more like pressing thing I wanted to ask you, and it's gone now. Um, I have a whole list. I think there's so much that this work has elicited in me, in a similar way to what you described as having such a passion for orienting my life in such a way that that signal is able to be accessible, and I have that relationship between secondary and primary, um, and that also influences what um, psychotherapy looks like for me and how I conceive of psychotherapy. And it feels like there's something, this conversation eventually, I hope, needs to be bigger about what leads to change in for people, and what is our nature, and what matters most in our own experiences, and helping people come into contact with themselves, because you can't tell somebody, oh, your nature is good. Like,
Mm-hmm.
yeah,
Yeah,
it's
yeah,
mm,
yeah. And I agree with you. I think this harkens back to a piece that you spoke to earlier, which is, when people first start going inwards, taking this journey towards them, who they fundamentally are, towards signal, spirit, they're going to encounter all the distortions to that on their way there. They're going to encounter what wasn't them. They're going to encounter sort
mm,
of in even those distortions that live in primary consciousness. By no means am I saying sort of, what happens in primary consciousness is absolutely always good and the truth or something like that. The distortions that we've learned about ourselves are also living in primary consciousness. It's just that when you finally contact them, then it all begins to move. It all begins to have this homeostatic self-correction towards what you actually are, right? So,
mm,
you can, people will go into their sessions, their psychedelic sessions, and encounter incredible levels of shame, right? They are not fundamentally shame, but shame has been living in their primary consciousness, which they've been trying to cover up and build a life on top of in
mm-hmm,
secondary
mm,
consciousness. So I'm fully saying that, yeah, no, you're gonna encounter different versions of the nightmare and different versions of the self of you that got created in response to that nightmare as you go into as you go into primary consciousness. But ultimately, just stay in it, stay in the flow of it, and it will keep burning off, right? So
mm,
that's the important thing, and I think that's why it's so useful in therapy, because it is constant flow, constant movement. The thing that is not you will continue to burn off, and all you have to do is make contact with it. You don't have to figure it out, you don't have to understand it, you don't have to like orchestrate or understand how to get to the other side of anything. All you have to do is stay in contact, and this signal will orchestrate this process for you.
mm, yeah, I think that's so helpful to hear, just for myself, and I imagine
Mm.
for others listening in. Um, yeah, there's a really subtle nuance to this work that's also quite simple. But because of I think because of that movement into primary is can be so filled with distortions, intrusion, like maybe more, I don't know if intrusions are the right word exactly, but distortions of who we are. It can be too much to ever go into without the right container.
Yeah.
For some people, it could lead to a, a dangerous re-traumatization and breakdown
Mhm.
of sanity of mind. But with the right container, it seems to be that actually is the direction of true sanity, of like really strong sanity.
Yeah, I fully agree with that. That, I mean, you know, just because we're describing this process in a way is in some ways inevitable once you're making contact, it doesn't mean that all of these other like container and support that absolutely needs to be in place. Again, your system knows what what the level of destabilization that is going to occur once you open the door to this. So yeah, you're going to need support with it. Absolutely. Relationship all the way.
Mm,
Yeah.
mm,
Yeah. I myself, I mean, I would, I would say, very trusting of this pathway in myself. And I was, doing my own cannabis sessions. And I would come up against these places inside myself where I couldn't explain what was going on, but it would be like just going away. My entire consciousness would be pulled away, almost like it felt like I was passing out. And
Mm,
then 5 seconds later, I would wake back up again, like like
mm.
I was being pulled out of existence and then popping back into existence.
Yeah,
And it
yeah.
was it was horror. I didn't like it, but I thought it was like I didn't understand it. And but I was getting plenty of like waves done and trauma processing done with it. But the first time I started sitting with somebody who was working with me using this model, and so in other words, the first time I did those sessions in relationship, I did not fall out of existence. I did not fall into dissociation. What opened up was just
Mm,
a whole subterranean layer of trauma and abuse. What I would consider my core trauma and abuse that I've experienced in my life really only was able to open up when I was in relationship with with
mm.
with someone doing this. Now, that's not to say, I mean, great work can be done if you're able to do this by yourself and you have, you're setting up the right container and everything like that. But I think the core of somebody's work really does require relationship.
Yeah, yes, I completely, that's true in my own experience. And something you said there was actually kind of like the question that was in the back of my mind that I wanted to ask that I
Mhm,
forgot.
mhm.
And it's funny that it's related to dissociation, but
Perfect. Perfect.
yeah. But but there's this, yeah, dissociation, that sort of passing out sensation or falling out of existence, um, that level of dissociation seems that some people who are spiritual practitioners want to cultivate
Yeah.
that. And
Mhm.
how you might not have the answer to this, and because I think it's a really big question and nuanced, but how to differentiate dis dissociation to the point of blanking out of existence with a you know between that and state one, um, but also between that and the idea of maybe like emptiness, or
Mhm.
this
Mhm.
idea of, if you I don't know if you're familiar with that term, but with the idea of, yeah, I'm thinking of like Wu Wei, or I'm
Uh-huh.
thinking of the Tao.
Yeah,
How
yeah.
to distinguish those two?
Oh, wow. What a question.
Yeah, see
What
if
a
you can answer that question now.
Wow. Well, I mean, okay. So first of all, I think the difficulty of answering that question is, even begin to talking about it, is like anybody listening to this is just going to have their own experience of what emptiness means, right? It's going to be such a subjective thing. Even though we're using the same word, it means different things for different people, especially where they're coming from based on their own history. But now, having said that, I think there is a difference between sort of, a spiritual or transpersonal experience of emptiness versus a, you know, a traumatic experience of emptiness, right? So meaning that, dissociation will absolutely create experiences of emptiness. And let's say somebody had such a difficult childhood, which, by the way, doesn't have to be that difficult at all for children to experience like really deep states of dissociation. you know they may have a lot of emptiness in their system, and it's a very different thing. These are two completely different things, and I feel like it's unfortunate and unfair to ask somebody who has had a lot of trauma-based emptiness in their life, and maybe throughout their entire childhood. For this person, they never got a chance to be a person. They never got a chance to sort of fully be here, and then they're hooking into some of these practices that are designed to have them sort of not be here, right?
Mm,
To experience that emptiness. And I think it's a very different experience of that, a perennial truth of emptiness, perhaps, or like the sort of that
Yeah.
existential quality of emptiness, to approach that from a place of traumatic emptiness versus from a place of that, no, you had a chance to be incarnate, you had a
Mm.
chance to be human, and then approaching the transpersonal. So I'll perhaps leave that question at those sort of vague, like high level strokes of the painting here, and not go any more detail into it, but just saying that, yeah, it's a different thing, to be traumatically empty.
Yeah, it was beautiful. Yeah, I think you really painted a picture for me that felt very satisfactory.
Mhm.
It's yeah, there is something, yeah, really sad and really I like how you said unfair, because there is an unfairness to it, to expect or to have these traumatic levels of dissociation and almost like a psychic death, and then to have someone engage in practices that are saying keep going, keep
Yeah,
like die more,
yeah,
and
yeah,
and how, yeah, there's like a certain, it feels like a soul injustice there. um
yeah, yeah. It's like, I don't know, like, were we born here just to not be here? Right? Did we? I mean, I think there's something for us in this experience of being a small self, a separate ego, a this incarnate human animal experience. I think there's something for us here in it. And so, for me personally, I'm not suggesting this for anybody else, but I want to live the hell out of that. I want to just like feel every little bit of being here that I can, because there's going to be a whole lot of existence where I don't get to be this, right? So
Mm.
I love when I have experienced um you know ceremonial work, I become the happiest monkey on this planet, and I don't go into the stars at all, and I'm just like, that's completely fine with me. and I don't need to go into the stars. It is so good to be here. And when I die, I'll go into the stars.
Mm. Wow. Mm. I want to end right here. Yeah. It's such a beautiful place to end.
And we can do a part two with all the other questions that you
I would
have.
love to. I would love to,
Yeah.
Saj. I have probably 15 questions that I didn't get to, because
Yeah.
there
Yeah.
was there was a signal that I felt we followed that.
We were in the signal, Anders. We were absolutely in the signal. Yeah. Our secondary consciousness was doing the talking, but the signal was running the show, I think. Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Really
This was
fun
great.
to talk to
This
you.
this was lovely, and it's lovely to meet you. Yeah. So
Yeah,
yeah.
likewise.
Hmm. Hmm.
Okay, I'm gonna stop this recording.